Chapter 5 of Popular History of Ireland, Book 9, by Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 5 The Catholic Confederation, its Civil Government and Military Establishment. How a tumultuous insurrection grew into a national organization, with a Senate, Executive, Treasury, Army, ships, and diplomacy, we are now to describe. It may, however, be assumed throughout the narrative that the success of the new Confederacy was quite as much to be attributed to the perverse policy of its enemies as to the counsels of its best leaders. The rising in the Midlands and Munster counties, and the formal adhesion of the Lords of the Pale, were two of the principal steps towards the end. A third was taken by the bishops of the province of Armagh, assembled in provincial synod at Kells, on the 22nd of March, 1642, where, with the exception of Dease of Meath, they unanimously pronounced the war just and lawful. After solemnly condemning all acts of private vengeance, and all those who usurped other men's estates, this provincial meeting invited a national synod to meet at Kilkenny on the 10th day of May following. On that day, accordingly, all the prelates then in the country, with the exception of Bishop Dease, met at Kilkenny. There were present O'Reilly, Archbishop of Armagh, Butler, Archbishop of Cashel, O'Keely, Archbishop of Tuam, David Roth, the venerable Bishop of Ossory, the Bishops of Clonfert, Elphin, Waterford, Lismore, Kildare, and Down and Connor, the Proctors of Dublin, Limerick, and Killaloe, with 16 other dignitaries and heads of religious orders, in all 29 prelates and superiors, or their representatives. The most remarkable attendants were, considering the circumstances of their province, the prelates of Connaught. Strafford's reign of terror was still painfully remembered west of the Shannon, and the immense family influence of Ulrich Burke, then Earl, and afterwards Marquis of Clanrickarde, was exerted to prevent the adhesion of the western population to the Confederacy. But the zeal of the Archbishop of Tuam, and the violence of the Governor of Galway, Sir Francis Willoughby, proved more than a counterpoise for the authority of Clanrickarde, and the recollection of Strafford. Connaught, though the last to come into the Confederation, was also the last to abandon it. The Synod of Kilkenny proceeded with the utmost solemnity and anxiety to consider the circumstances of their own and the neighbouring kingdoms. No equal number of men could have been found in Ireland, at that day, with an equal amount of knowledge of foreign and domestic politics. Many of them had spent years upon the Continent, while the French Huguenots had held their 100 cautionary towns, and leagues and associations were the ordinary instruments of popular resistance in the Netherlands and Germany. Nor were the events transpiring in the neighbouring island unknown or unweighed by that grave assembly. The true meaning and intent of the Scottish and English insurrections were by this time apparent to every one. The previous months had been especially fertile in events, calculated to rouse their most serious apprehensions. In March, the King fled from London to York; in April, the gates of Hull were shut in his face by Hotham, its governor; and in May, the Long Parliament voted a levy of 16,000, without the royal authority. The Earl of Warwick had been appointed the parliamentary commander of the fleet, and the Earl of Essex, their Lord General, with Cromwell as one of his captains. From that hour it was evident the sword alone could decide between Charles and his subjects. In Scotland, too, events were occurring in which Irish Catholics were vitally interested. The contest for the leadership of the Scottish Royalists between the Marquises of Hamilton and Montrose had occupied the early months of the year, and given their enemies of the Kirk and the Assembly full time to carry on their correspondence with the English Puritans. In April, all parties in Scotland agreed in despatching a force of 2,500 men, under the memorable Major Munro, for the protection of the Scottish settlers in Ulster. On the 15th of that month this officer landed at Carrickfergus, which was given up to him by agreement, with the royalist Colonel Chichester. The fortress, which was by much the strongest in that quarter, continued for 6 years the headquarters of the Scottish general, with whom we shall have occasion to meet again. The state of Anglo-Irish affairs was for some months one of disorganization and confusion. In January and February the King had been frequently induced to denounce by proclamation his Irish rebels. He had offered the Parliament to lead their reinforcements in person, had urged the sending of arms and men, and had repeatedly declared that he would never consent to tolerate popery in that country. He had failed to satisfy his enemies, by these profuse professions had dishonoured himself, and disgusted many who were far from being hostile to his person or family. Parsons and Borlase were still continued in the government, and Coote was entrusted by them, on all possible occasions, with a command distinct from that of Ormond. Having proclaimed the Lords of the Pale rebels for refusing to trust their persons within the walls of Dublin, Coote was employed during January to destroy Swords, their place of rendezvous, and to ravage the estates of their adherents in that neighbourhood. In the same month 1100 veterans arrived at Dublin under Sir Simon Harcourt. Early in February arrived Sir Richard Grenville with 400 horse, and soon after Lieutenant Colonel George Monk, afterwards Duke of Albemarle, with Lord Leicester's regiment, 1500 strong. Up to this period Ormond had been restrained by the Justices, who were as timid as they were cruel, to operations within an easy march of Dublin. He had driven the O'Moores and their allies out of Naas, he had reinforced some garrisons in Kildare, he had broken up, though not without much loss, an entrenched camp of the O'Byrnes at Kilsalgan Wood, on the borders of Dublin. At last the Justices felt secure enough, at the beginning of March, to allow him to march to the relief of Drogheda. Sir Phelim O'Neil had invested the place for more than 3 months, had been twice repulsed from its walls, made a last desperate attempt, towards the end of February, but with no better success. After many lives were lost, the impetuous lawyer-soldier was obliged to retire, and on the 8th of March, hearing of Ormond's approach at the head of 4,000 fresh troops, he hastily retreated northward. On receiving this report, the Justices recalled Ormond to the capital. Sir Henry Tichborne and Lord Moore were despatched with a strong force, on the rear of the Ulster forces, and drove them out of Ardee and Dundalk, the latter after a sharp action. The march of Ormond into Meath had, however, been productive of offers of submission from many of the gentry of the Pale, who attended the meetings at Crofty and Tara. Lord Dunsany and Sir John Netterville actually surrendered on the Earl's guarantee, and were sent to Dublin. Lords Gormanston, Netterville, and Slane offered by letter to follow their example, but the 2 former were, on reaching the city, thrust into the dungeons of the castle, by order of the Justices, and the proposals of the latter were rejected with contumely. About the same time the Long Parliament passed an Act declaring 2,500,000 acres of the property of Irish recusants forfeited to the State, and guaranteeing to all English adventurers contributing to the expenses of the war, and all soldiers serving in it, grants of land in proportion to their service and contribution. This Act, and a letter from Lord Essex, the Parliamentarian Commander-in-Chief, recommending the transportation of captured recusants to the West Indian colonies, effectually put a stop to these negotiations. In Ulster, by the end of April, there were 19,000 troops, regulars and volunteers, in the garrison or in the field. Newry was taken by Monroe and Chichester, where 80 men and women and 2 priests were put to death. Magennis was obliged to abandon Down, and McMahon Monaghan, Sir Phelim was driven to burn Armagh and Dungannon, and to take his last stand at Charlemont. In a severe action with Sir Robert and Sir William Stewart, he had displayed his usual courage with better than his usual fortune, which perhaps we may attribute to the presence with him of Sir Alexander Macdonald, brother to Lord Antrim, the famous Colkitto of the Irish and Scottish wars. But the severest defeat which the Confederates had was in the heart of Leinster, at the hamlet of Kilrush, within 4 miles of Athy. Lord Ormond, returning from a second reinforcement of Naas and other Kildare forts, at the head by English account of 4,000 men, found on the 13th of April the Catholics of the Midland counties, under Lords Mountgarrett, Ikerrin, and Dunboyne, Sir Morgan Kavanagh, Rory O'Moore, and Hugh O'Byrne, drawn up by his report, 8,000 strong, to dispute his passage. With Ormond were the Lord Dillon, Lord Brabazon, Sir Richard Grenville, Sir Charles Coote, and Sir T. Lucas. The combat was short but murderous. The Confederates left 700 men, including Sir Morgan Kavanagh, and some other officers, dead on the field. The remainder retreated in order, and Ormond, with an inconsiderable diminution of numbers, returned in triumph to Dublin. For this victory the Long Parliament, in a moment of enthusiasm, voted the Lieutenant General a jewel worth 500 pounds. If any satisfaction could be derived from such an incident, the violent death of their most ruthless enemy, Sir Charles Coote, might have afforded the Catholics some consolation. That merciless sabrer, after the combat at Kilrush, had been employed in reinforcing Birr, and relieving the castle of Geashel, which the Lady Letitia of Offaly held against the neighbouring tribe of O'Dempsey. On his return from this service he made a foray against a Catholic force, which had mustered in the neighbourhood of Trim, Here, on the night of the 7th of May, heading a sally of his troop, he fell by a musket shot, not without suspicion of being fired from his own ranks. His son and namesake, who imitated him in all things, was ennobled at the Restoration by the title of the Earl of Monturath. In Munster, the President St. Leger, though lately reinforced by 1,000 men from England, did not consider himself strong enough for other than occasional forays into the neighbouring county, and little was effected in that province. Such was the condition of affairs at home and abroad when the National Synod assembled at Kilkenny. As the most popular tribunal invested with the highest moral power in the kingdom, it was their arduous task to establish order and authority among the chaotic elements of the Revolution. By the admission of those most opposed to them they conducted their deliberations for nearly 3 weeks with equal prudence and energy. The first, on the motion of the venerable Bishop Ross, framed an oath of association to be publicly taken by all their adherents, by the first part of which they were bound to bear true faith and allegiance to King Charles and his lawful successors, to maintain the fundamental laws of Ireland, the free exercise of the Roman Catholic faith and religion. By the second part of this oath all Confederate Catholics, for so they were to be called, as solemnly bound themselves never to accept or submit to any peace without the consent and approbation of the General Assembly of the said Confederate Catholics. They then proceeded to make certain constitutions, declaring the war just and lawful, condemning emulations and distinctions founded on distinctions of race, such as New and Old Irish, ordaining an elective council for each province, and a supreme or national council for the whole kingdom, condemning as excommunicate all who should, having taken the oath, violate it, or who should be guilty of murder, violence to persons, or plunder under pretence of the war. Although the attendance of the lay leaders of the movement at Kilkenny was far from general, the exigencies of the case compelled them to nominate, with the concurrence of the bishops, the first Supreme Council of which Lord Mountgarrett was chosen president, and Mr. Richard Belling, an accomplished writer and lawyer, secretary. By this body a General Assembly of the entire nation was summoned to meet at the same city, on the 23rd of October following, the anniversary of the Ulster Rising, commonly called by the English party Lord Maguire's Day. The choice of such an occasion by men of Mountgarrett's and Selling's moderation and judgment, 6 months after the date of the alleged massacre, would form another proof, if any were now needed, that none of the alleged atrocities were yet associated with the memory of that particular day. The events of the 5 months, which intervened between the adjournment of the National Synod at the end of May, and the meeting of the General Assembly on the 23rd of October, may be best summed up under the head of the respective provinces. 1. The oath of Confederation was taken with enthusiasm in Munster, a provincial council elected, and General Barry chosen commander-in-chief. Barry made an attempt upon Cork, which was repulsed, but a few days later the not less important city of Limerick opened its gates to the Confederates, and on the 21st of June the citadel was breached and surrendered by Courtenay, the governor. On the 2nd of July St. Leger died at Cork, it was said of vexation for the loss of Limerick, and the command devolved on his son-in-law, Lord Inchiquin, a pupil of the School of Wards, and a soldier of the school of Sir Charles Coote. With Inchiquin was associated the Earl of Barrymore for the civil administration, but on Barrymore's death in September both powers remained for 12 months in the hands of the survivor. The gain of Limerick was followed by the taking of Loughgar and Askeaton, but was counterbalanced by the defeat of Liscarroll, when the Irish loss was 800 men, with several colours. Inchiquin reported only 20 killed, including the young Lord Kinalmeaky, one of the 5 sons whom the Earl of Cork gave to this war. 2. In Connaught, Lord Clanrickarde was still unable to avert a general outbreak. In vain the western prelates besought him in a pathetic remonstrance to place himself at the head of its injured inhabitants, and take the command of the province. He continued to play a middle part between the President, Lord Ranelagh, Sir Charles Coote the younger, and Willoughby, Governor of Galway, until the popular impatience burst all control. The chief of the O'Flahertys seized Clanrickarde's castle of Aughrenure, and the young men of Galway, with a skill and decision quite equal to that of the Derry apprentices of an after day, seized an English ship containing arms and supplies, lying in the bay, marched to the church of St. Nicholas, took the Confederate oath, and shut Willoughby up in the citadel. Clanrickarde hastened to extinguish this spark of resistance, and induced the townsmen to capitulate on his personal guarantee. But Willoughby, on the arrival of reinforcements, under the fanatical Lord Forbes, at once set the truce made by Clanricarde at defiance, burned the suburbs, sacked the churches, and, during August and September, exercised a reign of terror in the town. About the same time local risings took place in Sligo, Mayo, and Roscommon, at first with such success that the president of the province, Lord Ranelagh, shut himself up in the castle of Athlone, where he was closely besieged. 3. In Leinster, no military movement of much importance was made, in consequence of the jealousy the Justices entertained of Ormond, and the emptiness of the treasury. In June, the Long Parliament remitted over the paltry sum of 11,500 pounds to the Justices, and 2,000 of the troops, which had all but mutinied for their pay, were despatched under Ormond to the relief of Athlone. Commissioners arrived during the summer, appointed by the Parliament to report on the affairs of Ireland, to whom the Justices submitted a penal code worthy of the brain of Draco or Domitian. Ormond was raised to the rank of Marquis by the King, while the army he commanded grew more and more divided, by intrigues emanating from the castle and beyond the Channel. Before the month of October, James Touchet, Earl of Castlehaven, an adventurous nobleman, possessed of large estates both in Ireland and England, effected his escape from Dublin Castle, where he had been imprisoned on suspicion by Parsons and Borlase, and joined the Confederation at Kilkenny. In September, Colonel Thomas Preston, the brave defender of Leuven, uncle to Lord Gormanston, landed at Wexford, with 3 frigates and several transports, containing a few siege guns, field pieces, and other stores, 500 officers, and a number of engineers. 4. In Ulster, where the first blow was struck, and the first hopes were excited, the prospect had become suddenly overclouded. Monroe took Dunluce from Lord Antrim by the same stratagem by which Sir Phelim took Charlemont, inviting himself as a guest, and arresting his host at his own table. A want of cordial co-operation between the Scotch commander and the Undertakers alone prevented them extinguishing, in one vigorous campaign, the northern insurrection. So weak and disorganized were now the thousands who had risen at a bound one short year before, that the garrisons of Enniskillen, Denny, Newry, and Drogheda, scoured almost unopposed the neighbouring counties. The troops of Cole, Hamilton, the Stewarts, Chichesters, and Conways found little opposition, and gave no quarter. Sir William Cole, among his claims of service rendered to the state, enumerated 7,000 of the rebels famished to death, within a circuit of a few miles from Enniskillen. The disheartened and disorganized natives were seriously deliberating a wholesale emigration to the Scottish Highlands, when a word of magic effect was whispered from sea coast to the interior. On the 6th of July, Colonel Owen Roe O'Neil arrived off Donegal with a single ship, a single company of veterans, 100 officers, and a considerable quantity of ammunition. He landed at Doe Castle, and was escorted by his kinsman, Sir Phelim, to the fort of Charlemont. A general meeting of the northern clans was quickly called at Clones, in Monaghan, and there, on an early day after his arrival, Owen O'Neil was elected General-in-Chief of the Catholic army of the North, Sir Phelim resigning in his favour, and taking instead the barren title of President of Ulster. At the same moment Lord Leven arrived from Scotland with the remainder of the 10,000 voted by the Parliament of that kingdom. He had known O'Neil abroad, had a high opinion of his abilities, and wrote to express his surprise that a man of his reputation should be engaged in so bad a cause, to which O'Neil replied that he had a better right to come to the relief of his own country than his lordship had to march into England against his lawful king. Leven, before returning home, urged Monroe to act with promptitude, for that he might expect a severe lesson if the new commander once succeeded in collecting an army. But Monroe proved deaf to this advice, and while the Scottish and English forces in the province would have amounted, if united, to 20,000 foot and 1,000 horse, they gave O'Neil time enough to embody, officer, drill, and arm, at least provisionally, a force not to be despised by even twice their numbers. End of Chapter 5. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.